A family once broken stands at the edge of healing. With no demands and no conditions, Diep steps into the space where resentment once lived. Her quiet empathy becomes the bridge across years of silence, pride, and pain, mending the fractured bonds that even blood could not repair. In choosing understanding over judgment, Diep proves that sometimes the power to unite a family does not come from authority or force, but from a heart willing to forgive.
At first glance, James's family looked like everything people secretly wished for. A grand house stood behind tall iron gates, polished marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers, and silence ruled every corridor like an invisible law. To outsiders, it was the silence of success. To James, it was the silence of distance, heavy, cold, and unforgiving. Growing up, James learned early that love in his family was expressed through discipline, expectations, and achievement. His father believed that control was protection, that power was the clearest form of care. Every decision had already been made before James could even think to question it. What school to attend, what career to pursue, whom to associate with, all carefully arranged like chess pieces on a board. And James, though obedient on the surface, carried quiet fractures deep within his heart. Then Diep entered his life, gently, almost unnoticed at first. She did not arrive with confidence sharpened by privilege or words polished by education. She arrived with warmth in her eyes, with patience in her pauses, and with a presence that made silence feel safe rather than suffocating. Where James's world was built on authority, Diep's was shaped by understanding. She had grown up learning to read emotions instead of rules, to survive through empathy rather than power. The first time Diep stepped into James's family home, she felt the tension immediately. It clung to the air, thick and unspoken, like old dust that had never been disturbed. Conversations were polite but hollow, smiles practiced but cautious. No one argued, and yet no one truly spoke. Diep sensed what others ignored. This family was not broken by conflict, but by years of unsaid words.
She noticed how James straightened his shoulders when his father entered the room, how his voice softened into restraint. She saw the way his mother avoided eye contact, choosing silence over disagreement. And in those small gestures, Diep understood something deeply familiar, the quiet pain of people who had learned to endure rather than connect. Diep did not judge. She did not challenge. She simply observed, storing these moments gently in her heart. Curiosity stirred within her, not the kind that seeks answers, but the kind that seeks understanding. How could a family so close in blood feel so distant in soul? How many households in everyday life looked just like this, complete on the outside, fractured within? That night, as James stood by the window overlooking the city lights, Diep realized something profound. The walls that separated this family were not built overnight, and they would not fall through confrontation. If they were ever to be mended, it would not be through force, but through empathy, quiet and patient, like water slowly finding its way through stone.
Some changes begin loudly, with arguments and tears. Others begin so quietly that no one notices, not even the people being changed. Diep chose the second path. In James's family, mornings followed a strict rhythm. Breakfast was served at the same time every day, conversations measured, emotions carefully folded away like unused napkins. Diep sat among them, listening more than speaking. She learned that behind every rigid rule lived a hidden fear, and behind every sharp command was a man terrified of losing control. James's father did not raise his voice often, but when he did, the room froze. Power had trained everyone to listen, but never to understand. Diep wondered how many families shared the same habit, how many dinners ended with full plates but empty hearts, how many parents mistook authority for love, and how many children mistook silence for respect. One afternoon, Diep found James's mother alone in the garden, trimming roses that had grown wild along the stone wall. The woman's hands moved carefully, almost timidly, as if even flowers could argue back. Diep offered to help, kneeling beside her without asking questions. At first, there was only the sound of scissors and falling petals. Then, slowly, words emerged. Not complaints, not accusations, but memories. James's mother spoke of the woman she used to be before marriage, before expectations hardened her choices. She spoke of dreams postponed, of laughter that felt inappropriate in a house built on seriousness. Diep did not interrupt. She did not advise. She listened, fully, respectfully, and in doing so, gave the woman something she had not received in years: permission to be heard. That evening, Diep surprised James by asking about his childhood, not the achievements he usually listed, but the moments that made him feel small, invisible, unsure. James hesitated, then spoke of nights spent proving himself, of love earned through success rather than presence. His voice faltered, and Diep reached for his hand, not to fix him, but to stay with him in that truth. Empathy, Diep realized, did not demand immediate change. It softened the ground first. Gradually, the house began to shift. Conversations lasted a few minutes longer. Silences felt less threatening. James's father noticed it too, not the cause, but the effect. People were speaking more, listening deeper. He did not understand how it happened, only that control was no longer enough to hold his family together. And for the first time, a question began to form in his mind, one he had never dared to ask before. What if strength did not mean being obeyed, but being understood?
Walls do not collapse all at once. They crack first, quietly, almost politely, as if asking for permission to fall. James's father had built his life on certainty. Every decision followed logic, every emotion was weighed against reputation, and every relationship existed within clear boundaries. For decades, this structure had protected him, or so he believed. But Diep's presence began to expose something unsettling. The family was not united by strength, but held together by fear of disappointing him. It started with small disruptions. James's younger sister laughed too loudly during dinner and did not apologize. James spoke up when he disagreed, his voice calm but firm. Even James's mother began leaving the dining table early, choosing the quiet of her room over forced politeness. None of these moments were dramatic, yet each one struck James's father like a faint echo of loss, control slipping through his fingers. One evening, an argument broke out over something trivial: a business decision, a delayed contract, a perceived lack of respect. Voices rose. Old accusations surfaced, long buried under years of discipline. James's father spoke of sacrifice, of how everything he did was for the family. James responded with a truth he had carried since childhood: "We never asked you to stop being human." The room fell silent.
Diep stood there, heart pounding, unsure if she had the right to speak. But she had learned that empathy sometimes meant stepping forward, even when fear whispered to stay quiet. She did not defend James. She did not challenge his father. Instead, she asked a simple question, one that hung in the air like unfinished music. Did anyone ever ask you what you needed? The question struck deeper than anger ever could. James's father turned away, his back stiff, his shoulders heavy with years of unspoken burden. For the first time, the family saw not a leader, but a man, tired, aging, unsure how to exist without authority. The power he had relied on suddenly felt fragile, even lonely. That night, he could not sleep. Memories returned uninvited. His own father's silence, the harsh lessons that taught him love must be earned. He realized he had repeated the same pattern, mistaking distance for dignity, discipline for devotion. The next morning, something unexpected happened. He asked Diep to join him for tea. No agenda, no lecture, just two people sitting across from each other, sunlight filling the space between them. He did not apologize, not yet, but he listened, truly listened. And in that quiet exchange, the wall between generations weakened. Diep understood then, healing was not about winning arguments. It was about allowing cracks to appear, letting light enter places long kept dark. Sometimes,
breaking a family apart was not the danger. Refusing to let it change was.
Some bridges are not built of steel or stone. They are made of patience, of words spoken gently, and of silences finally shared. After that quiet morning of tea, nothing changed immediately, and yet everything had. James's father did not suddenly become warm, nor did old habits disappear overnight, but the sharp edges softened. His footsteps slowed. His voice, once commanding, began to hesitate, as though learning a new language he had ignored all his life. Diep noticed it first in the smallest moments. He asked James if he had eaten. He waited for an answer. At dinner, he no longer sat at the head of the table like a judge presiding over a trial, but among them, awkward and uncertain, like a guest learning how to belong. These were not grand gestures, but they carried weight, the kind felt in everyday homes, in families trying to love better than they were taught. The true test came one evening when neighbors and distant relatives gathered, curious eyes watching, whispering as they always did. This time, when someone questioned Diep's place beside James, the room held its breath. Old instincts urged James's father to remain silent, to protect status rather than hearts. Silence had always been his shield. But he spoke. "She is part of this family," he said, his voice steady but raw, "because she taught us how to listen to one another." The words were simple, yet they landed like thunder. James felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he hadn't known how to untie. His mother wiped away quiet tears. James's sister smiled without fear. And Diep, standing there, realized that empathy does not erase the past, it reshapes the future. Later that night, James and Diep walked home under dim streetlights, their shadows stretching long on the pavement. They talked about ordinary things, work, food, tomorrow, because healing, they understood, lives in the ordinary. Happiness was not loud, it was steady, it was earned. James's father watched them from the window, feeling both pride and regret. He knew he could never undo the years of distance, but he could choose differently now, and that choice, repeated each day, became his quiet redemption. Families fracture not because they are weak, but because they forget how to cross the distance between them. That night, the bridge held, not because it was perfect, but because everyone finally stepped onto it together.
One of the most important lessons we learn from this story is that empathy has the power to heal what pride, fear, and silence have broken for years. In many families, conflicts do not begin with hatred, but with misunderstanding. People hurt one another not because they do not care, but because they do not know how to listen. Empathy is not about agreeing with everyone or giving up one's values. It is about choosing to understand before judging. Diep did not try to change James's family through arguments or demands. Instead, she listened, she observed, she spoke gently, at the right moments, with sincerity rather than anger. This teaches us that soft words often travel farther than loud voices. Another lesson is that change takes time. Healing does not happen in one conversation or one apology. James's father did not transform overnight. His growth appeared in small actions, waiting, asking, speaking when silence would have been easier. In real life, these small steps matter. They are signs of effort, and effort is the foundation of genuine change.
The story also reminds us that love sometimes means courage. It takes courage to face family expectations, to challenge old beliefs, and to admit past mistakes. James learned that protecting the people he loves does not always mean fighting others. Sometimes it means standing still, holding space, and allowing truth to unfold naturally. Finally, the greatest lesson is that families are not defined by perfection, but by willingness. Willingness to listen, willingness to forgive, willingness to grow together. When people choose empathy over ego and understanding over control, even the deepest divides can be bridged. In everyday life, we may not face dramatic conflicts, but we all encounter moments where we can choose kindness instead of judgment, And often, that simple choice is enough to change everything.